project, a 3-year project which started back in April 2011, set up primarily to survey juniper stands across the county. These are stands of juniper which were surveyed back in the 70s by a woman called Lena Ward, who worked for the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And the county is a fantastic stronghold for juniper. There are more than 260 stands across the county, so it's quite a big job to survey them all. The first thing we did as a result was to try and recruit as many volunteers as we could to go out and do the surveys, and within 2 months of the project starting we had 40 volunteers signed up to do the surveys, and this was great. But at the same time, if you've got a sort of mass participation survey to do, you've instantly got some difficulties in standardising the way the data is collected. So what we did was we put all of the 40 volunteers through a day's training before they were then sent out to carry out surveys independently. As well as this, the project does aim to restore juniper stands, to identify those stands most in need of restoration, and then to restore them through a variety of methods. One thing that we do with the results from our surveys is to write management recommendations and management plans, which then go off to the landowner and to Natural England, and these can then be used in agri-environment schemes, in high-level stewardship schemes which are currently being set up for lots of Lake District farmers. So that's one way that restoration can work, and the restoration on the one hand can be a change in grazing regimes, particularly reducing the numbers of sheep on the hill, or reducing the numbers of sheep which are outwintered on the fells. And it's the outwintering of sheep that seems to be preventing regeneration in most cases. So if we can stop that or reduce the frequency of browsing of junipers in the winter, then that's going to be a good thing for juniper stands. We've completed a preliminary analysis of juniper stands, looking at 80 stands that were surveyed quite early on, and found that there's sort of mixed fortunes for the different juniper stands, and around 50% are either stable or healthy, but unfortunately around 30% are declining at a rapid rate, and those stands haven't regenerated, for example, in the last 60 years. They're heavily browsed, established bushes are heavily browsed at present, and there's no chance for any seedlings that might be trying to grow up around those stands. Juniper was actually planted for use in gunpowder production. So the charcoal being one of the 3 constituents of gunpowder, they were very picky about the charcoal that they used. So they used alder, birch and juniper preferentially. And unlike the other 2 species, juniper doesn't coppice, so if you cut it at its base, it doesn't re-sprout. So therefore you'd have to plant to keep up with the demand for this species. It'd be really interesting to find out more about this. It'd be interesting to find out more about how much juniper they actually used, how popular it was, whether they imported it from other countries, and to what extent they went to in the Lake District to try and exploit what was already there, and to conserve it with an eye on the future, and with the idea of keeping up with demand in the future.
I was brought up in Sedgwick on the Wharf Cottage. My grandparent worked at the mill, at the Sedgwick powder mill, and so did my father, both in, not actually with powder making, but with general jobs. I think my grandfather was a stoker and my father was listed as a general labourer. Regarding the raw materials for gunpowder, obviously most were imported, and in the latter years charcoal was imported. In fact, it was brought up by the railway to Hincaster side, in Hincaster being about a mile south of Sedgwick. Early claims are that the Cumbrian industry used local charcoal, made mostly from juniper wood or savin, but certainly not in latter years. And savin, of course, is quite a shrub rather than a tree, and so you require huge amounts of this.
Yeah, juniper's a really quite a common plant in Cumbria. Cumbria is a real stronghold for juniper, but in most cases it actually is found below 500 metres altitude, and this is quite strange given that juniper's original place in the landscape before man had a big effect on the landscape 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. Juniper's place would have been above the tree line in a habitat called montane scrub, and montane scrub is a habitat that can obviously withstand all the extremes of climate at high altitudes. And growing above the tree line is the tree line's the limit of tall tree growth. And above that, trees continue to grow, but they're much more stunted, twisted examples of the taller trees lower down the slope. And in amongst those trees, in amongst those twisted birches and rowans and pine, would be a lot of scrub species like juniper. And juniper would have been a major constituent of this montane scrub habitat. Other species that would be in there would typically be different willow species, maybe 5 or 6 different willow species, which again are quite low growing, and they grow in and around the juniper and the other trees. There are a lot of rare habitats that we talk about in this country now, habitats such as raised bog, lowland raised bog, perhaps the rarest habitat in the country. Well, actually we've already lost a habitat. There's a habitat that's extinct, certainly in England and almost so in Scotland as well, called montane scrub habitat. And this is despite the fact that we have many thousands of hectares of land above 500, 600 metres which could carry this habitat. We've found the fells for hundreds of years, and a lot of the species in amongst that mix of montane scrub species are quite palatable to sheep. So things like rowan and aspen trees and all of the willow species are incredibly palatable both to wild large herbivores such as red deer, but also to sheep and to cattle to a lesser extent. So those species have been browsed over time, regeneration has been halted, and they've just disappeared.